The City of London has always been the beating heart of Britain's economy. For centuries, it has attracted some of the largest and wealthiest corporations in the world. Yet no modern business has ever come close to the power, reach and influence of one extraordinary company, the East India Company. Founded over 400 years ago, the East India Company began as a small trading venture on Leadenhall Street in London. But over time, it transformed into something far greater. From humble origins, it grew into a multinational empire, with private armies, monopolized global trade, and ultimately became the de facto ruler of the Indian subcontinent. At its peak, the company was wealthier and stronger than many nation-states, controlling millions of lives and some of the richest lands on Earth. So, how did a private trading company rise to such unimaginable heights? And how did it eventually collapse? This is the fascinating history of the East India Company, the birth of a trading giant. The East India Company was established at the very end of the 16th century during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. At that time, Spain and Portugal dominated overseas trade, building empires in the Americas and Asia. Inspired by their success, other European nations, particularly England, France, and the Dutch Republic, wanted a share of this global wealth. But expeditions were risky and expensive. Governments often couldn't afford to fund them directly. This led to the creation of joint stock companies, where merchants and investors pooled their money to fund overseas ventures. If the mission succeeded, investors shared the profits. In 1600, a group of London merchants received a royal charter from Queen Elizabeth to trade with the East Indies. Thus, the Governor and Company of Merchants of London trading into the East Indies, better known as the East India Company, was born. Early struggles and first footholds. The company was not an instant success. During its early years, it faced stiff competition from the powerful Dutch East India Company and from the Portuguese, who already had a strong presence in Asia. By the 1610s, however, the English secured trade rights from local rulers in coastal India. In 1639, they purchased land on India's southeastern coast, establishing the settlement of Madras. Later, in 1661, the Portuguese handed over Bombay to England as part of a royal marriage treaty, and the East India Company quickly set up operations there. By the late 17th century, the company had multiple bases across India's coasts, laying the foundation for future expansion. Beyond trade, slavery and conflict, although best known for its trade in spices, tea and textiles, the East India Company was also involved in darker enterprises. It took part in the African slave trade, transporting enslaved people from Eastern Africa to India and Southeast Asia. These slaves were often forced to work in the company's factories and settlements. Meanwhile, competition with European rivals intensified. England and the Netherlands fought several wars during the 1600s, often sparked by clashes between their trading companies. By the 18th century, though, the East India Company began gaining the upper hand in India. The turning point came under the leadership of Robert Clive. Joining the company as a young clerk, Clive rose quickly through the ranks and became a military commander. In 1757, Clive led company forces to victory at the Battle of Plassey against the Nawab of Bengal. With fewer soldiers but superior weapons and tactics, the East India Company seized control of Bengal, one of the richest provinces in India. This victory marked the beginning of the company's transformation from a trading organisation into a territorial power. Over the next decades, the company expanded further, fighting wars against Indian powers like the Marathas, the Mughal Empire, and the Sultanate of Mysore. To sustain its campaigns, it recruited vast numbers of Indian soldiers, known as sepoys. By 1800, the East India Company commanded an army of over 200,000 men, larger than many European states at the time. A profitable empire. The company's dominance generated staggering wealth. It held a monopoly over British trade with India and imposed taxes on millions of Indian subjects. For every cup of tea drunk in Britain, every bolt of silk, every sack of spices, profits flowed back to London. Yet, its governance was often disastrous. The Bengal famine of 1770 killed around 10 million people, made worse by the company's failure to provide relief. Reports condemned its negligence, but the directors in London prioritised profits over people. Expansion into China and the Opium Wars. The East India Company's influence extended beyond India. In the 19th century, it aggressively pursued trade with China. When Chinese officials tried to ban the devastating opium trade, the company and the British government responded with force. The First Opium War, 1839-1842, ended with Britain seizing Hong Kong and forcing China to open its ports. The company's reach now spanned from the Atlantic to the Pacific, controlling some of the most lucrative markets in the world. The Great Rebellion of 1857. But the company's reign was not to last forever.
In 1857, resentment boiled over into a massive uprising, known as the Indian Rebellion of 1857, or the Sepoy Mutiny.
Triggered by religious and cultural tensions, as well as years of oppressive policies and heavy taxation, the revolt spread across northern India. Company rule collapsed in many regions, and both sides suffered enormous losses.
Over 6,000 British civilians were killed, alongside an estimated 800,000 Indians, many of whom died from violence, famine, and disease.
The rebellion convinced the British government that the company could no longer be trusted to govern India. The fall of the East India Company. In 1858, the British Parliament passed the Government of India Act, transferring control of India from the East India Company to the British Crown. From then on, India became a formal colony under the British Empire. Although stripped of its power, the company was not dissolved immediately. An earlier agreement required it to continue paying dividends to shareholders until 1873. Only then was it officially dissolved by law. Even after its end, the company's legacy lived on. British rule in India continued for almost another century, until independence was achieved in 1947.
Legacy of the world's most powerful company. The East India Company remains one of the most extraordinary and controversial organizations in history. At its height, it controlled half of the world's trade, maintained a massive private army, and ruled over millions of people. It pioneered modern capitalism, multinational corporations, and global trade networks, but also left behind a legacy of exploitation, famine, and colonial domination. In many ways, the East India Company was the first example of a corporation becoming too big to fail. But in the end, it became too big to exist.